going to talk about metamorphosis in the Metamorphoses. And I think that the strange title of Rome's second great epic sometimes passes us by because of its very familiarity. The Aeneid is about Aeneas, so is the Metamorphoses about Metamorphosis. Not a hero, not a story, nor even an event, but rather a type of event. You could imagine Homer's Iliad retitled a la Ovid, Deaths. Not such a bad idea. Of course, it is quite possible to claim that the Metamorphoses is not really about metamorphosis at all. That's just the title. And really it is about narrative or love or order or justice. But let us stay with metamorphosis and ask what kind of a subject that might be. Forms changed into new bodies, as Ovid puts it in his poem. But is this more than a rubric under which to collect a series of extraordinary stories? What is metamorphosis in the Metamorphoses about? I'm by no means the first to ask this question, and there have been many interesting answers. Change, metaphor, identity, art, fiction, embodiment, or more historically, the principle itself. All of these answers and many others have produced illuminating readings of metamorphosis and metamorphoses, and in fact, Ovid produces so many kinds, conditions, and circumstances of metamorphosis that he seems to be posing the question of the meaning of metamorphosis himself. A global interpretation is neither possible nor desirable, so I will restrict myself to one particular issue raised in the Metamorphoses, and that is the relation between humanity and nature. The Metamorphoses begins with an account of the origins of the cosmos from chaos, in which separations create an order of discrete and bounded domains. But it continues to tell the story after story of transgression of the boundaries that constitute order. The world of the Metamorphoses has been described as a crowded world, where gods, humans, and animals come up against each other, and as they do, they exchange positions. Gods become humans or animals, humans become gods or animals or plants, animals become human. To call the world crowded in this way is to assume that the different orders of being invade each other's space. And for that to be the case, we must recognize some affinity between them, rather than imagining parallel and non-continuous worlds, as we normally do. We might say that this jostling between what we had comfortably assumed to be different orders of being provokes us to ask questions about our status as humans. Ovid gives several accounts of the origins of humans, variously compounded of the divine and the inanimate, and asks, how natural are we? How divine are we? Several of Ovid's protagonists find themselves trying out the model of nature or divinity as a guide for human nature, sometimes with disastrous consequences. The gods marry their siblings, so why can't we? But my concern today is not so much with our ambiguous status within the order of being, as with Ovid's ways of imagining the continuity between the human and the natural. And I start with an observation of Leonard Barkin. He says, so the myths demonstrate that nature is meaningful to human experience because of its metamorphic, i.e. anthropomorphic origins, while the metamorphic myths are made explicable through parallels to transformations in nature which are familiar to us from real life. Barkin addresses the function of the myth on the one hand and what makes it plausible on the other. To take the second first. If we consider Ovid's descriptions of metamorphosis, we find, and here I quote Italo Calvino, that the event is no longer represented as a fable, but as a set of habitual and likely facts: growth, diminution, hardening, softening, curving, straightening, compression, rarefaction, etc. Process of transformation is reduced to a series of comparatively simple processes which are familiar to us from the experience of our own bodies. The human body, Ovid shows us, is a form among other forms and can be transformed into another form by simple and familiar changes in its components, lengthening this, shortening that, fusing, roughening, smoothing, etc. Ovid's metamorphoses are like those puzzles that ask us to find the minimum number of changes to get from this shape to that. The obverse of this vision is that familiar bodily changes, such as growth, maturation, birth, and death, are made strange, metamorphic, as one kind of change is assimilated to the other. So much for making the transformation explicable. But what about making nature meaningful? Nature is meaningful, Barkan says, because it is peopled by allegories of humanity, distilled and frozen stories. I want to put some pressure on Barkan's meaningful to human experience, and suggest that it is not just the fact of metamorphic origins that makes nature meaningful, but the thought of what it might take to get from the human to, for instance, the animal. In other words, I want to ask how the stories of metamorphosis imagine a single continuum of being and what it would take to pass along it. By passing along this continuum, of its characters evade the expected end of a tragic story in death. They can be quite self-conscious about the fact that metamorphosis is an alternative to death. Let me neither die nor live, says Mira, after committing incest with her father. Venus resolves to punish the Propoitides by death or exile, or some means halfway between the two, and that, what can it be? Elsewhere, metamorphosis is referred to as whatever is in between life and death. In Ovid's poem, human extremity does not come to an end when the body shuts down. Rather, it continues until one form of being becomes another. In this category, we have those figures who weep, sweat, sit until they dissolve or rigidify into another substance. What happens if the reduction of a human to a single action or emotional state just carries on without reaching a point of cut-off? Let us take the example of Niobe, who loses her sons and daughters at the hand of Apollo and Diana in revenge for her boastfulness. And I quote now from Melville's translation. She sat bereft amid her sons, her daughters and her husband, all lifeless corpses rigid in her ruin. Her hair no breeze can stir, her cheeks are drained and bloodless. In her doleful face her eyes stare fixed and hard, a lifelikeness without life. So too inside, that tongue of hers congeals, her palate's hard, no pulse beats in her veins, no way from neck to bend, nor arms to wave, nor feet to walk, and all within is stone. Yet still she, or it, weeps, flet Tamen, and in a whirling wind is swept back to her homeland. Fastened there upon a peak, she, or it, pines away, liquitur, and tears drop from the marble to this day. Niobe rigidifies with grief and suffering to the point that she transforms. Supposing the story went on, Ovid asks, not until she ceased to be, but until she ceased to be human and became something else. This is to imagine our place in nature, not on the basis of analogy, Lycaon is as savage as a wolf, nor on the basis of shared properties. A beautiful woman becomes a beautiful tree, her arms its branches, but on the basis of what it would take to pass along the continuum of being from one form to another. Stone and water are specializations, obsessions of the human, and so the story comes to an end not when the protagonist is dead, but when he or she passes out of storyness into, for instance, stoniness. And this happens when a human action reaches the limits of sameness beyond which story cannot follow it. But in the case of Niobe's transformation, something continues, flet Tamen, yet still she weeps, as Melville translates it, and liquitur, she pines away. Both of the personal pronouns are questionable and could be replaced by an it. The weeping stone could be an anthropomorphism or the realization of a figurative cliché. His speech could have made rocks weep. Liquitur literally liquefies, and only metaphorically pines could also have it as subject. But Latin does not make us choose between the pronouns, and the effect is to make Niobe's being continuous with the stone, which is itself a continuous state of being rather than just a substance. Arethusa undergoes the opposite transformation, and pursued by the river god Alpheus, she is protected by Diana, who envelops her in a thick mist. But as the god circles around her, she is like a lamb or a hare pursued by predators. And then, as the god stops and waits outside the cloud, a cold sweat breaks out. A cold and drenching sweat broke out, and rivulets of silvery drops poured from my body,
Where I moved my foot, a trickle spread. A stream fell from my hair. And sooner than I now can tell the tale, I turned to water. But the river knew that water, knew his love, and changed again, his human form discarding, and resumed his watery self to mingle, miscat, the stream with me. Ovid's pun on the sexual meaning of misceo, mingle his stream with me, implies that as water mingling with water, the god finally has his way. But does he? How far can the story take us after Arethusa has undergone her transformation? And how much does this story of erotic pursuit and flight depend on a human body? In what sense is it a she who is telling this story? It's often remarked that very few of the many paintings that were inspired by Ovid's Metamorphoses represent the process of metamorphosis itself. One of the notable exceptions is Bernini's great sculpture of Daphne and Apollo. I'm sure you know it. One of the most familiar of modern Ovidian images. As Apollo catches up with the fleeing Daphne, what Bernini emphasizes is the continuity between Daphne's reaching to elude Apollo's grasp and the transformation of her arms into branches. The emotional extremity expressed by her reaching concentrates on the physical extremity of her fingertips, which sprout into the leafy branches of a tree. At the point where Daphne is all reaching, she passes along the continuum of being, an event which is visualized as the sprouting of leaves. This is not how Ovid presents the scene. In fact, Ovid describes an opposite physical process, in which a languid torpor takes over the fleeing Daphne's limbs and her running feet change into roots. But if Bernini's sculpture is not true to the letter of Ovid's text, it is true to its spirit, in representing the natural world as an extension of the human at its point of extremity, both physical and emotional. Daphne and Arethusa are both metamorphosed when they are pushed to extremity by the threat of rape. Florence Dupont has provocatively put the alternatives faced by these women threatened with rape as that between two forms of bodily change, self-reproduction or self-metamorphosis. Her article is called Se reproduire ou se métamorphoser. In effect, Dupont's alternatives perform an Ovidian trick of making the familiar strange by aligning the act of giving birth as reproduction with metamorphosis, two actions performed on the self. But in a sense, the metamorphosed Daphne does reproduce herself, in that she is transformed not only into a tree, but into a species of tree, the laurel. And this brings me to my second approach to the relation between the human and the natural in the Metamorphoses. Many of Ovid's stories account for the existence of a particular species. In other words, the transformation is not only from human to animal, vegetable, or mineral, but also from individual to species. The end of the story is not death, but the end of the story itself, or we could say that the difference between individual and species is that individuals have stories, but species have instinct, at least until Darwin gave species a story. Let me illustrate this with one of the shortest and least commented stories in the Metamorphoses, the story of Aeschylus, in which transformation is specifically the denial or prevention of death. In the aftermath of the story of Ceyx and Alcyone, an unnamed old man points out a bird which he says is of royal stock, and then he tells the story of Aeschylus. Aeschylus, though the brother of Hector, hated the town and lived an inglorious life in the country, but he was no rustic at heart and fell in love with the nymph Hesperia. To a point, the story follows a familiar path. She ran away from him, and as he chased her, was bitten by a snake and died. Aeschylus, distraught, tries to commit suicide, but Tethys takes pity on him and clothes him with feathers. You know how it goes. Then, from a cliff top that the booming waves had eaten out below, he flung himself into the sea. In pity as he fell, Tethys received him gently, and as he swam, clothed him with feathers. Thus the golden chance of death so much desired was never given. The lover, outraged to be forced to live against his will, to find his soul that longed to leave its lamentable home, restrained with new wings on his shoulders, flew aloft and once more launched himself into the waves. His feathers broke his fall. Pluma levat casus. In fury then, poor Aeschylus dived down into the deep, trying endlessly to take the road to death. Love made him lean, his jointed legs are long, and long his neck, and long his head extends. He loves the sea, Ikora amat. That name of his he keeps, a diver, a mergus, for he dives into its deeps. Aeschylus, finding consciousness and individuality unbearable, tries to escape them through death. But Tethys finds another way to achieve this and turns him into a species, a diver bird, which repeatedly dives into water. The human story stutters at the point of Aeschylus' suicide attempt, and as it does so, its protagonist passes from individual to species. Pluma levat casus, not only in the literal physical sense that feathers make his fall a light one, but also in a more abstract sense that the transformation takes away the burden of disaster, levat casus. Human consciousness and the desire to be rid of it passes into animal instinct, the expression of a species. And now there's a bird. He has the name of the diver. As the diver bird, Aeschylus no longer expresses frustration when he repeats the same action again and again. That is simply a repetitive drive of animal instinct. But what is so disturbing about this story is the potential for reading it in the other direction. You see that bird? Well, it's really a human trying unsuccessfully and repeatedly to commit suicide. On this reading, there is a hideous misfit between what the bird appears to be doing and what the entrapped human is trying to do. The instinctual, repetitive drive of the animal, in fact, expresses the desperate desire of the human to do something definitive, to achieve closure. Tethys' pity becomes a form of torture, and for Aeschylus, lightness of being has become unbearable. Perhaps it is the capacity for reading this metamorphosis in both directions, one a rescue from consciousness, the other a torment worthy of Dante, that makes this story such a powerful imagining of the relation between the human and the natural. Once again, the language of the final lines is ambiguous. Ikora amat could express emotion, he loves the water, or it could just mean that this species of bird is found near water. See Virgil's Amantis litera myrtos. Earlier, Aeschylus was referred to as the lover, amant. Now the same word indicates a bird's habitat. The relation between individual and species is put at issue in a different way by the story of Arachne at the beginning of Book 6. Arachne is a weaver whose skill is renowned far and wide, but she denies that she has learned her skill from Minerva. Minerva appears to her, disguised as an old woman, to persuade her to acknowledge the goddess as the source of her skill. All gifts come from God, which Arachne refuses to do, adding that if Minerva herself were to appear, they could compete and decide the matter. Minerva then reveals herself, and the game is on. The episode is famous of its detailed description of the tapestries that Arachne and Minerva weave in the competition to which the foolhardy Arachne challenges the goddess. Surprisingly, Minerva can find no fault in Arachne's work, which only increases her fury, and she strikes Arachne with her shuttle. Arachne is suffering so much that she tries to hang herself, a fate from which Minerva saves her by turning her into a spider. Live, yes, live, but hang, she says. The goddess then sprinkles her with drugs, and Arachne becomes, as her name suggests, a spider. And as a spider, still weaving her web, pursues her former skill, as Ovid adds in Melville's translation. Actually, he says, exercet arania telas, as a spider she works her loom. But Melville pinpoints the essential point. Can, or do we, call this skill? What is the relation between human artistry and the automatic productions of nature? One way to answer this question is to ask whether Minerva could feel jealous of or threatened by the skill of the spider. Do we feel diminished by the skill or athletic prowess of animals? Minerva finds a way of making undeniable the fact that Arachne's skill is not her own. I want to end with a third and quite different way that the Metamorphoses frames the relation between the human and the natural, in this case the animal. This has to do with metamorphosis as a principle of thematic transformation, as well as a narrated event, and more to do with bodies and being. Certainly there are many dimensions to the Metamorphoses concerned with bodiliness and embodiment. Does identity reside in the mind or the body? How important to being human is it that we have this body and not another? Can you be trapped in your own body? These are all questions that come to mind while reading Ovid's epic. But the question I want to ask is this: how significant for our own bodies is it that we are surrounded by just these other bodies, bodies for which we feel attraction, fear, disgust, and so on, and to which we link our own bodies by metaphor? I'm going to look at how just one of those other bodies interferes with ours. Snakes, for instance. What is a snake? Among other things, a bundle of potentialities of the human body. A shuddering disgust, for instance, the ultimate in unpleasant tactility, a sinuous coiling and slithering insinuation that marks the opposite extreme to the motions of the articulated human body. In the Metamorphoses, Ovid likes to play variations on a theme, and in Book 4 there are 3 passages that involve snakes, though each has quite a different take on the human body. Let's begin with the second of these, the story of Athamas and Ino. Ino is the sister of Semele, on whom Jupiter fathers the god Bacchus. After a jealous Juno has tricked Semele into having Jupiter incinerate her, Ino fosters the child. But Juno is still angry at Ino's pride in her divine connections, and as so often in this work, the goddess resolves on revenge. She visits the underworld to recruit one of the Furies, Tisiphone, to drive Ino and her husband Athamas mad so that they murder their own children. We relish, with a horrible frisson, the image of the snakes hissing, spitting, and flickering their tongues on Tisiphone's breasts and the bodies of Ino and Athamas. Snakes dislodged gave hissing sounds. Some crawled upon her shoulders, some gliding round her bosom vomited a slime of venom, flickering their tongues and hissing horribly. Then from her hair she tore out 2, and with a doom-charged aim darted them. Down the breasts of Athamas and Ino, winding, twisting, they exhaled their noisome breath, yet never any wound to see the fateful fang affects their minds. Ovid follows this with a story that requires us to resist the reflexive shudder at the serpentine that we have just experienced. In the next episode, Cadmus, in accordance with a prophecy delivered several books ago, turns into a snake. His wife, Harmonia, watches with horror as Cadmus's limbs lose their articulation and he is stretched into one long belly. The snake, as we learn from Cadmus's transformation, is a human body without its articulation. Harmonia calls after her husband as he disappears into the snake, and Cadmus slithers across to his wife and crawls affectionately over her body. He licked his poor wife's cheeks and glided down to her dear breasts as if familiar there, and coiled, embracing round the neck he knew. All who were there, and courtiers were there, were terrified, but she caressed and stroked her crested dragon's long, sleek neck, and then suddenly there were 2, their coils entwined. They crawled for cover to a copse nearby. Serpentine imagery, Ovid reminds us, is as compatible with our language of affection and lovemaking as of disgust and horror. When Harmonia caresses the slippery neck of the plumed serpent, Latin is mellifluous, lubrica permulcet cristati colla draconis, an expression more apt to raise a giggle than a shudder. Then suddenly there are 2 snakes, wrapped in a joint coiling, juncto volumine. The twisting togetherness of the snakes is a reductio ad absurdum of erotic intercourse. As the 2 snakes slink away together, the attractive becomes disgusting, or vice versa. Ovid unsettles our physical reflexes by playing on the range of physical associations that cluster around the snake. In a famous essay on symbolism in the Aeneid, Bernard Knox pointed out that Book 2 of the Aeneid is permeated by related imagery of snakes and fire, and that this imagery plays a crucial role in shadowing the transitions and ambiguities that attend the fall of Rome, a disaster that paradoxically enables the foundation of Rome. There's a turning point, both in the valence of snakes and in the story of the Aeneid, at the end of Book 2, where Aeneas escapes from captured Troy. At the end of the book, the hair of Aeneas' son Ascanius bursts into flame without harming him. This portent is expressed in serpentine language that recalls the strangling of the Trojan priest Laocoon and his sons by the giant snake earlier in Book 2. In particular, the fire licks and feeds on him, as the snakes did on Laocoon and his sons. The same words, lambere and pasci, return from the Laocoon passage as the harmless flame licks Ascanius. The word lambere, lick, is picked up by Ovid when Cadmus the snake licks his wife's cheek, and Ovid's terrified bystanders recall the terrified reaction of Ascanius' family in Book 2. Marchesi, in fact, in his commentary, calls Cadmus, hailed into exile by Juno, a figure of Aeneas. I think it's clear that Ovid had read Bernard Knox, and is playing with and against what Virgil does with snakes in Aeneid 2. Unlike the Aeneid, Ovid's epic is not a story. It is an epic of variety. And instead of underlining the narrative progression, like Virgil in Aeneid 2, Ovid is looking at the different ways in which the understanding and experience of our own bodies is affected by the simple fact that there are also snakes. There's one more significant appearance of a snake in Book 4, and as with Cadmus and Harmonia, it is connected with the intercourse between two human bodies, though intercourse of a very different kind. In the metamorphic act of sex, Salmacis and Hermaphroditus become one to produce the hermaphrodite. But Salmacis is an unusual figure in Ovid's epic of love, for she is a sexual aggressor. I said earlier that Ovid likes to play variations on a theme, and few themes are as pervasive in the Metamorphoses as rape. But just how susceptible is it to variation? Can a woman rape a man, for instance? How could one imagine such a thing? "I've won, he's mine," she cried, and flung aside her clothes and plunged far out into the pool and grappled him, and as he struggled, forced her kisses, willy-nilly fondled him, caressed him, now on one side, now the other, clung to him as he fought to escape her hold, and so at last entwined him like a snake seized by the king of birds and borne aloft, which as it hangs coils round his heads and claws, and with its tail entwines his spreading wings. Or ivy wrapping round tall forest trees, or in the sea a squid whose whipping arms seize and from every side surround their prey. The youth fought back, denied the nymph her joy, she strained the more, her clinging body seemed fixed fast to his. "Fool, fight me as you will," she cried, "you'll not escape. Ye gods ordain, no day shall ever dawn to part us twain." It's certainly a very different image of physical intercourse from the joint coiling of Cadmus and Harmonia. The whole passage reads like a parody of the many male rapes in the Met, for this is the victory of the weak. If water is yielding, it is also encompassing. Salmacis is poured around Hermaphroditus, circumfunditur. The ivy that is so often in Latin literature a figure for the devotion and dependency of the weaker sex has now become threatening, and it has been able to do so with the help of the snake simile. Within a very short span of text then, we have had two very different versions of sexual intercourse, both using serpentine imagery, and we have also responded to two quite opposed sensations of snakes on the skin. Virgil's serpentine imagery in the second book of the Aeneid does what we expect poetic imagery to do. It supports the meaning, creating threads of association which make an argument parallel to the narrative. Ovid's snakes in this section of the Metamorphoses do something different. They bundle physical sensations and images of bodily togetherness in paradoxical and contradictory ways. Ovid leaves us wondering what to make of snakes, and more importantly, what they make of us. reminding us that we are bodies among other bodies in a world in which it is a contingent fact that there are also snakes. Of course, it's impossible to think about what it means to be human without thinking about the non-human. But in Ovid's Metamorphoses, this is not restricted to thinking in terms of contrasts and oppositions. What is distinctive about the Metamorphoses is its concern with the continuum rather than the orders of being, and with the implication of the human form with the other forms that surround it. It is in these terms that the Metamorphoses frames the question of what makes nature meaningful to us. Thank you.